It's high, high, hey, the army's on its way. Held off the cages out and strong. For wherever we go, you will always know that the army goes rolling along.
Hi, welcome to Pegasus Research Substack Weekend in Review Unscripted number 21 podcast. I am Thomas, the founder of and the author for Pegasus Research. I'm an economist, a military historian, and a U.S. Army veteran. If you like my content and want to support my work, please consider becoming a subscriber or follower on Substack or support me on Patreon. The website will be in the description section of this podcast. Welcome, everybody. I hope that you have been having a great weekend. If you're listening on the weekend, if you're listening to me later in the week, I hope your week is going well. So I'm going to cover the 4 papers from this week, or Substack articles from this week. Papers, I just talk like I'm in college still. All right, the first is the Turkish President Erdogan overplayed his hand. World diplomacy is working in the shadows in regard to Ukraine. Starliner's tribulation contributing to Boeing's headaches. And finally, a short one on the West Philippine Sea newsletter, volume 10. So we will start with, seems like a long time ago, did President Erdogan overplay his hand? This is going back to the prisoner exchange that occurred last week, which was the largest prisoner exchange between the West and the former Soviet Union, Russia. So this is the largest prisoner exchange since the Cold War. The prisoner exchange included involvement from U.S., Germany, Russia, I think Scandinavia, I think Norway was involved as well. Turkey obviously played a key role in facilitating the exchange. The exchange did actually occur in Turkey. Russians flew down to Ankara, and then the West also flew into Ankara as well, and that's where the exchange took place. This probably worked because I've written about this a number of times, that Turkey has maintained solid relations with both Russia and Ukraine, and allowing it to have a sense of legitimacy to actually discuss peace, and in many cases talk about trying to restart the peace talks. Both President Putin and President Zelensky have commented on the Turkish peace plan, and both presidents have talked about that the Turkish peace formula from 2022 is still a legitimate formulation for a peace process in the future. So he has maintained good relations. He's been able to talk to both presidents, both countries. He facilitated the grain deal, so he has a sense of legitimacy with both countries, and so he could actually pull off this prisoner exchange between the East and the West. Again, Turkey's in a strategic position along the former Soviet Union southern border, kind of sits in that crossroads of the world, and that's probably also helps it that has maintained good relations. Again, is the gatekeeper to the Black Sea through the Bosporus and Dardanelles. Again, Black Sea, both Ukraine and Russia, for example, Crimea is all in the Black Sea, and Turkey maintains the gateway to that part of the world. Also, Turkey is a NATO country, but again, it's maintained those good relations with both Ukraine and Russia. Even if you go into the Byzantine Empire and the role of when the Muslims overthrew the Byzantine Empire, much of the Byzantine Empire either went to parts of Rome, where many of the documentation from the period of the Renaissance appeared in Rome, coming from the now defeated Byzantine Empire, and then much of it went to Moscow. So, kind of an unknown factor about the relationship between Turkey and Russia. And again, again, President Erdogan has been playing a commitment to peace in the Ukraine war, but he's not been able to get a peace breakthrough, and so even despite the trust, he's not been able to restart peace talks. The other part is, I wrote about this last week, is, and I think earlier, I wrote this paper obviously last week, talked about the unpredictable ways of President Erdogan, including supporting Hamas and its struggle against Israel. So that's unusual. He's got ties with the Muslim Brotherhood, which was started the Arab Spring, which eventually started the mass migration into Europe. So he's got an interesting history, and he's also has some issues with other NATO countries, and we'll talk about that shortly. President Erdogan, again, he has supported Hamas, not necessarily materially, but certainly morally. So despite his commitments to peace, he does side with the Hamas side. Now, he did not endorse the October 7th, 2023 attack in Gaza, where Hamas killed 1,200 Jewish people in the Gaza region. I think about took 250 hostages or so. And he did offer to negotiate an end to the conflict before Israel began its ground operations in Gaza. So obviously he was trying to head off he expected was going to be a brutal result or brutal campaign in Gaza. And it turned out it has been both politically a bruising for Israel, even though they were the ones that were attacked. But I won't go into the details of that because I don't want to get into the discussions between between the Palestinians and the two-state solution and the one-state solution, and I don't want to get into those parts of the negotiations. We're just going to focus on President Erdogan in this case. So don't take that as a statement of support or non-support of either side. I'm trying to take a neutral point on this right now. I do say I am Western-centric, so if you see some favoritism on the side, anybody who says they're truly neutral is really lying to you or not being truthful to themselves, I guess is probably the best way to say that. So we're going to try to avoid delving into the issues of the Gaza war and the 1,200 people that were killed at the beginning and the 39,000 roughly that have died, mainly Gazans, since the war has started. And I bring that part up because Erdogan has used the rage of the 39,000 killed in Gaza to really rage against the Israelis. He expressed anti-Zionist sentiments. He's compared Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to Hitler and accusing him of genocide in the Gaza war. Now, Turkey and Israel did have a strong, lucrative bilateral trade in the Mediterranean, as much building material that Israel was buying came from Turkey. And it was in the area, I think I read it's like about $100 million a month of trade, mainly through small business between Israel and Turkey. Now, Erdogan has made these public and undiplomatic accusations against Israel and its leadership. And this is somebody that understands the idea of diplomatic speak, because obviously he's been able to speak with two warring parties in the Ukraine war. So he understands diplomatic speak. So he is purposely being inflammatory in his accusations. And we will see that he's got a history of doing this. So the lucrative, first off, President Erdogan ended the lucrative trade between Turkey and Israel. Again, that was mainly a small business trade. It wasn't like it was state-funded trading or anything like that. So that definitely hurt smaller business people in Turkey. But I guess if you've got to stand on principles, that's what you do. Erdogan has also made he's talked about public and undiplomatic accusations against Israel. And then he did say, again, this was all occurred around the time of the prisoner exchange. He stated that Turkey could enter the war and support the Palestinians, stating that the Turkish response would have to be strong enough for Israel to cease its attacks. Now, Israel's Foreign Minister Israel Katz rebuked Erdogan in comparing his actions to those of Saddam Hussein and calling on NATO to expel Turkey from the military alliance. Now, the comparison to Saddam Hussein was, this was prior, obviously, to his overthrow. He attacked Israel during the Gulf War of 1990-1991, trying to break the coalition that was arrayed against him when he invaded Kuwait and threatened Saudi Arabia. And then Saddam Hussein also was paying families of any terrorist that was killed in a suicide attack or killed in a attack against Israelis. So that's where that Saddam Hussein comments comes from. Now, I'm kind of not glossing over it, but I'm lightly going into it. I'm not going into all the details of that, but that's where that comparison came from. Now, one thing I'll say about what Minister Israel Katz said is, my belief is that it is not Israel's position to tell or dictate to NATO about what it is to do with within its military alliances. Now, the one thing is that this comes from a couple issues. I'll go into this briefly. Is first off, to go into the NATO part, there is no mechanism in NATO to expel a member from the alliance. So again, it requires unanimous consent. So you would assume that anybody any country that's trying to be expelled would also have say so in their expulsion. So they could simply say, no, I don't want to be expelled, so I have to stay. So NATO does not have a mechanism for it, and if they did create a mechanism for it, they would have to have unanimous consent. So you just don't see that this as being a practical opportunity, and nor was it Israel's official. It wasn't in the Israeli officials' position to sit there and tell NATO what to do. Now, why this comes up, why the Foreign Minister Katz said this to NATO, is Erdogan has stated, and this was at the Washington NATO summit in July. He stated that it was impossible for NATO to interact with Israel as long as the current Israeli administration, Prime Minister Netanyahu, was in power. Now, again, NATO has unanimous clause that requires all members to consent to NATO policy, so it's within Turkey's right to block any NATO interaction with Israel. Now, what was Israel, or some of the interactions with Israel was around, obviously there's the terrorist aspect, being Israel in the Middle East. There's also Israel has worked on air defense systems, like famously the Iron Dome, but also Arrow 3. And Arrow 3 is part of the ESSI, European Sky Initiative of Germany, and its Chancellor Olaf Scholz. So what's happened in this case is it limits the ability of Germany to interact with Israel. Now, Germany can act as an independent nation, they can act as an EU nation, but in the context of NATO, he is blocked from cooperating with Israel on interoperability of Arrow 3, which is both an American and Israeli developed missile system, anti-missile, anti-aircraft missile system. So this does add some complications to other European security concerns, and it does play somewhat of a role in how Ukraine gets supported as well, though that's kind of on the back burner, is as Patriot systems are being asked or being requested by NATO leadership from its member countries to send more Patriot systems to Ukraine. They are looking at the possibility of, again, ESSI, supplementing the Patriot batteries with Arrow 3 missiles, again, American Israeli made. So it does cause some complications, Erdogan's blocking of this of NATO interaction with Israel. Now, I will sit there and say Erdogan's undiplomatic attitudes towards Israel are out of place in the world of international diplomacy. And this is true because, okay, first off, we go into there, it's like, this is not how you get things done. Now, what he's doing in NATO is he is perfectly within his rights to do that, just as I've said with Hungary and the Slovak Republic, that they are allowed to block actions within NATO because it's within their rights to do it, because that's the way the rules are written. So that's not what I'm saying, that he's being undiplomatic. It's his statements calling the leader of Israel a Jew Hitler. And now that's just, it is purposely inflammatory, purposely insulting towards, obviously, people of the Jewish faith. So and this is something that he knows it's wrong because, again, this is somebody that can communicate. He understands the power of diplomacy because he's able to talk to Russia. He's able to talk to Ukraine. Both sides of the biggest land war since World War II in Europe. So he understands diplomacy. So this is purposely inflammatory, most likely trying to help himself align with other members of the Islamic world, maybe just try to lift Turkey to be one of those leadership positions within the Islamic world, maybe much like what the Ottoman Empire was. So right when you look at the Islamic world, you look at the Shia side, Iran, Sunni and side of it, you look at Egypt, Saudi Arabia obviously having Mecca. And some of the other holy sites, obviously, is probably considered the leader of the Sunni side. But Egypt, obviously, I think they're the biggest Sunni, but that might fall under Indonesia now. But I'm not 100% sure on that. But Turkey's not considered the leader in the Arab world, and it seems like he's probably saying a lot of these inflammatory views towards Israel and its leadership to try to put himself into some form of legitimacy within the Islamic world, and again, in the same breath as Iran, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. Now, he has done some other things in his career. He has threatened fellow NATO country, and I guess you could say historical rival, Greece, with missile attacks, which is just completely, again, inflammatory. It's not helpful. Why would you threaten another NATO country? But NATO can't throw Turkey out. There's no mechanism for it. But it just seems like this is just a ridiculous statement that a fellow NATO country, because he has some historical showboating, I guess, for lack of a better word, threatens another NATO country with missile attacks. Is absolutely ridiculous to say this. You can sit there and say that other NATO countries have rivalries and they don't do this. You could sit there and go through all these European countries, France and Germany, Spain and France, Italy and France, Italy and Germany from World War II. And so it just goes on and on. So the rivalries have no position when you're talking about a military alliance. So this is just, again, just a absolute ridiculous, irresponsible statement where Erdogan, and again, these are intentional acts. He also did during former Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, he asked, there's a fair-sized Turkish diaspora in Germany, and he told those people, those Turkish members of the diaspora in Germany, to vote against Angela Merkel because she and Germany were the enemy of Turkey. And this is, again, coming from a country that is another NATO country, and he's speaking out against them. So this is, again, just one of those ridiculous statements, and he knows better. So these are intentional acts that he's doing, that he knows what diplomacy is, and he's purposely being undiplomatic to serve his own purposes. So he's basically creating, he wants to be the diplomatic, or seen as some leader in the Islamic world. Again, Turkey does have the second biggest army in NATO. It is a fairly powerful country. It is an Islamic country, but it aligns itself very much at that crossroads between Europe and Asia. So that means the Christian Europe, the democratic Europe, and looking at the side to the east. It's in that crossroads area. And so he's trying to align both sides, and he's doing it through rhetoric that he knows is not diplomatic. So again, it comes into showmanship, and it comes up as irresponsible showmanship. So it makes Turkey look like a pariah state in the same area of Iran and North Korea when he does things like threaten Greece, or threaten or call Germany the enemy of the Turks or the Turkish people, calling the leader of Israel Hitler. And so if you really care about ending the war, and then also I guess going in there threatening to go to war or entering the conflict in Gaza, how does he do it? He doesn't have a plan to do that. So this is just rhetorical language. It would be different as if Turkey was on the border of Israel and could actually threaten, but they're nowhere near that. They don't have the Navy to do it. So this was just a flat out irresponsible rhetorical act, and he knows better. So again, this is trying to inflame the base in the Islamic world. Again, probably trying to establish Turkey as some leader in the Muslim world, again, in the same breath of Iran, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. So what Erdogan has done, he's brought Turkey to a new crossroads between being a reliably self-aware of its position and also dangerously self-indulgent, as this President Erdogan has really overplayed his hand. So again, I've said a lot of good things about Erdogan. I think it's admirable, his push for peace. But then when you look at him at the totality, it's no wonder the Europeans don't trust him, why the Muslim world doesn't completely trust him, why Israel doesn't trust him. But I mean, that goes into some other parts of the world as well. So it just goes in there is that, again, these are purposely showman type attitudes that should be a leader, a responsible leader of a country, a leader that is in the crossroads of Asia and Europe, an important player in the geographically for both NATO. He should be using that position that he sits in the crossroads of Europe and crossroads of NATO and the Russian East, that he could really become a really productive, influential part of basically general diplomacy in the region. Obviously, there's a lot of conflict between Russia and, again, in the Muslim world and Israel. He could play a responsible position, and he is not doing this just because he wants to be self-indulgent and he wants to be something bigger than what he is not. So that's what I wrote about the Erdogan overplaying his hand. Again, he's done some very impressive things, and showing that he understands diplomacy, and then turning around and doing boneheaded things like this that shows that he is, when he shows that he's clearly aware these are not amateur mistakes, these are intentional inflammatory statements and completely have no place in a leader of a country that sits that's so geographically significant in the world. So that's what I have on that one, and we'll go on to the next subject. All right, so the next subject is world diplomacy is working in the shadows in regard to Ukraine. And this is an unexciting world of finance. And the fact is, wars are not free. So this is kind of a boring subject, I will admit. I'm an economist, and I don't get excited that much about finance, but it is an important issue, and it is somewhat instructive of where this war is going. So We'll obviously we'll look at this week. Obviously, the Ukrainians have had made a significant splash. I don't want to call it a victory yet, but they have definitely made a significant splash in the Kursk region of the in the Ukraine war, which is inside Russia. So it basically a large cross-border incursion into Russia. If anybody knows anything about, I think I actually wrote a little bit about this. If anybody knows, I think I did early in my Substack, I did a little quick historical series that didn't get that much traction. I was going to do like parts 2 of the Battle of Kursk. So the Battle of Kursk in World War II was the site of the biggest tank battle in world history. So the Ukrainians, partially armed with German tanks and German APCs, is back in Kursk. So German vehicles are once again in the Kursk region. So again, nothing near as big as what it was in World War II. So they have obviously made some type of big splash, but the overall, what you've seen in the summer offensive and the spring offensive before that, the Russians have really been squeezing the Ukrainians. It's not been a splashy offensive, but it has been a lot of pressure on the Ukrainians in the Donbass regions, and have slowly pushed the Ukrainians back. They have inflicted a lot of casualties. So it has not been a good campaign season for the Ukrainians. And this was expected. There wasn't going to be any splashy offensives of this year like there was last year. So they understood that they were going to have to take the Russian offensives, and they knew they also had manpower issues. And then obviously there was delays on receiving Western weapons, which is, to me, was significant, but I don't think it was as significant as the delays in decisions to start drafting more men into the field. I understand why the Ukrainians were doing that, trying to preserve as many young people, exempt them from military service for the long-term future of the country. Again, the idea is, not to wipe out a generation of young men and young women in a war, and then not be able to have a future. Ukrainians, for lack of a better thing, is not having any more babies. Obviously, if you have a generation of people wiped out in warfare, in the meat grinder of slow grinding offenses that the Russians are doing, you don't have a future, or a much less future. So I understand why the Ukrainians were slow to draft younger men into the military, because again, the average age of a soldier in Ukraine is in their 40s. So obviously trying to call up more people. They're having to call up more young people. So that has obviously caused an issue. So they knew that the spring and summer were going to be tough periods for Ukrainians. Even the I can't remember his exact name. I think he's the the deputy general for military intelligence in Ukraine. He may have been replaced, but he said that it was going to be a tough spring and summer for the Ukrainians. And then he thought that some type of form of peace would come around in 2025, some type of negotiated settlement. So this kind of goes into what was going on in the with the, basically call it the financing of the war. Now, one signal about the war might be coming to an end is, again, some people are reading into that prisoner exchange between Russia and the West as being a significant action to start opening up the negotiation, because obviously the two countries had to be negotiating with each other through most likely Turkey playing a role, again, going back into the undiplomatic actions of an unreliable Erdogan, who can be masterful in international diplomacy and absolutely a dismal failure in other aspects. So you go into that part, you read into what does that prisoner exchange. Obviously, some negotiations are going on with the West and Russia despite this war. And then the other part was the Ukrainians had a Eurobond debt repayment due by August of this year. And this was a major issue. Now, this wasn't going to knock Ukraine out of the war. It would just require, first off, Ukraine would default on their debt, and it would be very hard for them to get any type of future loans or anything like that. And that's important for a country that has to rebuild from war. So it obviously had to look at the perspective of financing. So they had a debt payment. They didn't look like they were not going to be making it. So there was going to have to be some type of negotiation with the bondholders to determine what can they restructure the debt payment. Now, why I say this when I knocked Ukraine out of the war is the West probably would have just stepped up and given them more money, maybe do loan guarantees, maybe assume the payments, some of the debt payments of on their own, but they would have done something. It just would have cost the West more money. And when you start asking for more money, that's starting to get pushed back on from some of the voters of each of these countries that support Ukraine. So again, it would not have knocked the war. It just would have added another complication to the war, especially support coming from the Western nations, because a large part of the Western support is not just military. A big part of it is just to keep the Ukrainian government and society going. The idea is because if the government doesn't have the money, obviously, a large portion of their country has been taken by the Russians. That means that they're generating less GDP than they were before. Now they have fewer people to take care of, so that kind of goes in. But anyway, they don't have as much GDP. So if they can't make their payments to citizens through, providing normal services, providing pensions to retirees, then you've got, in the middle of a war, you have a social collapse. So a large portion of the support coming from the West is just to keep the Ukrainian government and its role in society functional, to keep them in the war. Well, we could argue back and forth on that about the amount of support the West gives, but they made a decision to do that. And I'm just going into, again, trying to be neutral down the line, is the reason a large part of the Western support is just to keep the government functioning and to keep society running. But then again, they're not. The Ukraine government has suspended habeas corpus, and they have not, and they suspended all elections. So you can go into that. They're supporting a non-democratic government, but again, a government that is in war, and a war that was not brought upon the Ukrainians. We could go into the policy leading up to it, from the Budapest memorandum all the way up to February 2022. So we won't get into that. But anyway, so what was happening was the Ukraine was seeking international backing to secure Russians' participation in the peace talks. So this is kind of the background. While this debt payment's going on, while this prisoner exchange is going on, Ukraine is also trying to seek international support to get Russia to participate in the upcoming peace talks sometime in the fall. Hasn't been designated, not sure it's going to be Swiss, but this is something that they've been trying to, President Zelensky is trying to get secured, because he doesn't want to repeat the failures of the Swiss peace talks when Russia was not even invited to attend. And that was an absolute disaster is probably an overstatement. It was not a good look. Ukraine lost a lot of international goodwill. They've lost the ability of the Chinese did not participate, and they specifically cited that Russia was not participated and were not invited. And so the Chinese, being a major ally, the biggest ally of the Russians, decided not to attend. This was a blow to Ukraine. So what Ukraine has been doing is they've been doing, obviously they've been stepping up attacks on Russia, because one thing is that outside these bond payments, and we'll come back to that here in a minute, is Ukraine is trying to step up the cost of the war, increase the cost of the war on the Russians to make them come to the bargaining table, because there's very little that Ukraine can do at the point of view is trying to get them to come to the bargaining table. There's very little that Ukraine can do because there's nothing much Ukraine can offer the Russians that they can't simply, meaning Russia, cannot simply take on the battlefield. So there's not a lot of leverage right now that Ukraine has in trying to negotiate peace talks with it, in which then you go into what I just discussed earlier was the Kursk attack into Russia. That's, again, increasing the cost of the war, trying to incentivize Russia to agree to participate in the upcoming fall peace talks. Now, I'm not saying that's the reason for the Kursk offensive, but it certainly gives some form of leverage to the Ukrainians to try to get the Russians to attend the peace talks. Again, this is happening. Weapons are being used. Western weapons are being used against Russia against Russian targets inside Russia. They've got obviously this negotiation. So there's a lot of moving parts that are going on right now inside Russia. Now, are they completely unrelated? That's possible, but I tend to think that when there's been very little public movement, all of a sudden there is a lot of public movement. And again, this will tie back into about the debt payment. So Russia believes Ukraine cannot keep up the pace. Again, with all these Western weapons being used, Russia believes that they can just weather the storm. This thing in Kursk is a bad PR disaster, but it's not militarily crushing to the Russians. But it's a bad look. It's increasing the cost of the war, and it might cost them some support of its citizens. But the Russians also know that the Ukrainians can't keep up the pace. They are using a lot of their long-range Western weapons, and once a lot of those are used up, not sure when the next batch is coming in, or if they're going to have to back off on using those long-range weapons to allow the stockpiles to rebuild and use them for future operations. So Russia believes that the Ukraine cannot keep up this pace of attack. So Russia's not being necessarily motivated. This was written before the Kursk offensive, so I'm kind of adding in some of the Kursk points of view in this, but I didn't write anything about Kursk in this particular paper. So the other thing is that Ukraine needed to get other incentives to get Russia to come to the peace talks. So what Ukraine was invited to go to Beijing. Now, this has been an important part for the Ukrainian diplomacy to bring the Russians to the peace table, is they've got to have the Chinese to put some pressure on the Russians, because the Ukrainians alone cannot generate enough pressure on Russians to make them come to the bargaining table. But China can. China is the biggest trading partner for Ukraine. So what Ukraine did is when their foreign minister met the foreign minister of China in Beijing, I think it's Wang Yi is the foreign minister of China, and Kuleba, Dmytro Kuleba, I believe is his name, is this foreign minister of Ukraine. He went to Beijing, and in the talks, he did not get a guarantee from the Chinese that they would try to get the Russians to attend the peace talks, but typically the Chinese would not be that upfront with a major ally that they said, well, okay, now we're going to pressure the Russians to attend the peace talks. Anything like that will be done behind closed doors and not in public. So they might have had an agreement to do that. But right now, it looks like Ukraine didn't really get anything out of this, except China did get the Ukrainians to recognize the one China policy regarding Hong Kong and Taiwan. Basically, it's just saying that both of these are Chinese, and the Taiwan question is an internal affair issue. This is contrary to the West, and the West are the ones that are supporting Ukraine. So Ukraine agreed to a major Chinese concession to recognize that Hong Kong and Taiwan were internal issues of the Chinese government, and in exchange, they did get China said that Ukraine is available for the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a global project of the Chinese to fund infrastructure projects throughout the world. They're not doing it out of the goodness of their heart. They often create unpayable loan situations, and then the payback of the loans are usually involves some type of harsh penalty, usually requiring some country to give up sovereignty. But for example, the Belt and Road Initiative has been in Hungary, and Hungary, I think, has two major projects. I think Serbia has a project as well. Italy did have projects, but the current Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, she pulled Italy out of the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, why this is important is this also leads to an opportunity. One of the things that Russia has been saying is that the Ukraine cannot become a member of NATO, and Ukraine cannot become a member of EU. And I've talked this before. Russia and Ukraine used to have, depending on what administration is, Russia would provide some financial support if the current president, or if the Ukraine president was pro-Russian, there was some Russian financial support. That is not going to happen anymore. Though these two countries are forever divorced if they remain independent countries, which again, I think Ukraine will maintain it becoming an independent country, because I don't think Russia wants to be able to occupy all of Ukraine. They thought Afghanistan was was hard to contain. I think Ukraine would be in the magnitudes much worse for the Russians. So I don't see the Russians have an interest in trying to occupy Ukraine. But these two countries are forever divorced. Russia is not going to give financial support to Ukraine. And if Ukraine cannot become a member of the EU, there's going to be very little financial support that can be coming to Ukraine. So the Belt and Road Initiative kind of gives a little bone out there for peace negotiations of a way that China can provide some support to help the country rebuild. Now, during this week, also in Berlin, a European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, was in Berlin, and with several, or many, I think 600 government and non-government entities, including corporations, and we're talking about the cost of rebuilding Ukraine, and which they said would be in the area of 500 billion euros. So if EU is not going to cannot become or if Ukraine cannot become a member of the EU, the Belt and Road Initiative from China and the United States, Japan are going to fund this. I don't see either country being able to come up with a price tag like that. But it does throw another bone out there of that saying, if they can't become a member of EU, somebody that could help provide financial support to rebuilding would be China through the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, if I was Ukraine, would I really want China, a close ally of Russia, to provide the financial support to be able to rebuild? Russia just simply asked China to back off on especially after negotiations are done, just tells Russia to back off on or slow down the rate of Belt and Road Initiative funds, and basically just turn Ukraine into a vassal state. I just don't see the Ukrainians volunteering. But again, it throws in another option for peace talks. And so it opens the way that China could play a role, and China has tried to play a role in peace talks, though it has largely been rejected by the Ukrainians. But again, this opens the door for some type of compromise with the Ukraine accepting a Chinese leadership role in the negotiations. But Ukraine had to do that to go contrary to Western policy when it comes to the one China policy that Ukraine turned around and accepted, which is not something that you're seeing the Western countries doing. So with this allows, China has significant diplomatic and economic leverage with Russia. And it is a consistent supporting ally of Russia. So Russia would listen to them. So this might be a way for the Chinese to pressure the Russians to come to the bargaining table when Russia doesn't really feel any battlefield pressure to come to the negotiating table. So again, this provides a funding mechanism, at least as a way or a point of negotiations of Ukraine's financial support, because they're going to need financial support. And because Ukraine's not winning this war or not going to be able to outright beat Russia in detail, it's not like they can go back and ask for reparations. And no peace initiative from the Russians will include some type of rebuilding fee. So that's not going to happen. So there has to be a funding mechanism to rebuild Ukraine, or they just may, again, maintain it, become a vassal state. Now, I don't think anybody, European Union, United States, are going to accept that, and nor should they. Certainly Ukraine should not accept that. So it opens, it opens up a funding mechanism. It provides China to have an increased European profile, which the EU doesn't necessarily want. And it allows that with the Ukrainians compromising with the Chinese, it allows the Chinese to start trying to ask or pressure the Russians to come to the bargaining table and to conduct the face-to-face peace talks sometime in the fall, winter of 2024. Now, so this is a significant outcome. So here we got we have the negotiation for the prisoner exchange. We have this Ukraine acknowledging the one China policy in exchange to becoming eligible for Belt and Road, which would allow some form of rebuilding. The Ukrainians probably got something in return from the Chinese outside of just Belt and Road, that they've probably agreed to some type of peace formula with the Chinese, or at least compromised on a peace formula with the Chinese to get the Russians to attend peace talks. So it looks like some things are moving in the right direction. Not saying that peace is right around the corner, but it definitely is things moving. So this kind of goes back into the Euro debt bond issue. So it came from flat out Ukraine. The European bondholders knew this. The Ukrainians knew that the Ukrainians could not repay this loan with all these debt repayments coming up. And so the Ukraine negotiated with the bondholders to accept a 37% loss on the bond values, which will save about $12 billion in annual redebt payments from the Ukrainians. So it's going to make the terms easier for the Ukrainians to accept. Now, the agreement will allow Ukraine to re-enter the bond market, international bond market, when the security situation improves and reconstruction starts. Now, it doesn't say how reconstruction, but obviously they're talking about that Ukraine will be able to operate in the bond market. These are Euro bonds, so you're expecting this has probably got some type of tie-in with the European Union. The same European Commission structure that had that meeting in Berlin with 600 corporations and government entities from all around Europe discussing rebuilding on top of a Belt and Road initiative. Now, if the Euro bond holders knew, if they thought that this war was going to go on indefinitely, would they have actually bothered to renegotiate the debt repayments? Would they have just accepted default at that point, knowing that the war is continuing? So it seems like the Ukrainians are giving some indication to the bondholders that agreed to a 37% loss that this war is going to end soon. And again, Ukraine said, the part of the agreement is Ukraine will be allowed to re-enter the bond market when the security situation improves. So this is again starting to move towards opening ways for this war to end. And again, the holders would not have agreed to this. They would have probably just accepted default and probably gone back to the Western supporters of Ukraine to ask for some form of relief from them and not try to negotiate directly with Ukraine. Now, the West probably also played a role in that too, to help the Ukrainians negotiate through through the negotiations with the bondholders. So, but the fact that they agreed to this, and then part of it was re-entering the bond agreement when the security situation improves, that there is some form of optimism from the debt negotiations on behalf of the Ukrainian government. Had the Ukrainian government signaled that there's going to be some form of compromise to end the war. So the go into the Ukrainian fears that are also kind of spurring them on is Ukraine fear a Trump administration's going to put pressure on them to end the war. And that's certainly true because the administration has, or the Trump campaign has said that ending the war is a major policy goal of the president or the future, what could be the future president or the former president. I guess that's what I mean. He's the former president. That's a major goal that he wants to do. And he has signaled that from the beginning. So this is not like a new position. And this is a complete departure from the current administration that's willing to use escalatory policies, whether it's increasing the lethality of the weapons that's given to Ukraine or changing the policy of weapons use, again, allowing U.S. weapons to be used against Russian targets inside Russia. So the current administration is basically an escalatory policy with the hope that there's no roadmap for peace. It's just hoping that eventually the Russians will give in, which is not happening. Again, we talk about the demographic issues that are all in the favor of the Russians when compared to the Ukrainians. I've talked about that in several papers before. So the Ukrainians know that at some point they're going to be pressured if the November elections go towards former President Trump and not through Vice President Harris. You're going to see a departure. So they are looking at setting themselves up that they've got to get ready to start getting ready for peace talks because things are going to be changed. Now, China is concerned about, they want to avoid a Trump presidency, and they view Biden-Harris foreign policy as a more favorable policy towards them. Now, the reason why so China is more concerned about ending this war and giving Biden-Harris a foreign policy win to help their election prospects. Now, has the Biden-Harris administration been particularly strong against China? In one aspect, yes, and that's the formation of alliances, often a little bit of that leading from behind, but there's definitely a strong move towards alliances being formed in the Western Pacific to counter China and to a lesser extent North Korea. What President Trump, former President Trump's, his policy was to create economic pain to the Chinese, not try to form alliances, but make things hard for China to operate economically, which China still needs the economic support, not economic support. They need the economic trade with the United States and the Western world to keep their economy growing, which is already under a lot of pressure because the third plenum talked about the long-term goal, prospect for the Chinese economy was a downward trend. So China looks at it from the point of view is they'd rather allow the continuation of these alliances to form in Asia to counter them than taking this significant economic hardship. Again, on an economy that's already in a has downward pressure, and also I talked about last week, also demographic pressure as the Chinese population declines, creating more pressure on the future of China. Now, the reason why this is formed, are these alliances that the current administration are forming insignificant? No, these are serious alliances and creating a lot of complications to China. These alliances are not perfect. They are not all-incorporative way to handle the issues in China or in the Western Pacific. But what happens is China has the ability to turn the pressure up and down on the alliances. They could have the alliances, let's say, the pressure or the priority or the need to form these alliances, China could become less bellicose, less demanding of its demands in the South China Sea. It could cut down on its exercises and threats around Taiwan. It could try to look for some form of settlement with the Philippines to stop some of the encounters in there. So in this case, under the current administration, China can make their life easier by just turning down the pressure. They control the pressure. If President Trump comes in there and puts economic pain, yes, they could affect the Americans, but the Americans and the West have more pressure they can put on China than what China can put on the West. Not saying it'll be easy for the West, but again, on a economy that's already in downward pressure, if President Trump gets elected and he starts putting economic pressure, all the impetus, all the Americans will be the ones that are determining when to reduce the tension. So Chinese, the only way they can reduce the tension from an economics perspective is negotiate. They have to come to the Americans and negotiate some form of compromise. Again, most likely having to lose some form of economic clout. So it's the Chinese have a perspective of that it would help them to have a Biden-Harris win. So they are also moving towards the direction of trying to get a peace negotiation done before the elections. Now, that's 88 days away now as of this recording of August 10th, or it might be 87 days. So is this going to be able to get done? Probably not. Maybe a ceasefire is probably the best they could hope for. So China's kind of running against the clock here. So I don't think this is something that's at this point realistic. I think they've waited too long. But I think they're looking at the prospect of trying to give the Harris campaign a leg up on the over former President Trump's campaign. And this would actually, the Chinese would actually be working in the direction of, at least the public direction that you're seeing within Europe, that tend to fear the idea of, which I say quite irrationally, of another Trump presidency. So all that being said is that the Chinese are really going to probably put a lot of pressure, or put a fair amount of pressure, it'll be in the background, to get the peace talks going with Russia, or at least have Russia attend. Now, I'll go in there and say maybe the Biden has called President Putin about everything in the book, not quite as bad as President Erdogan called Benjamin Netanyahu, but it's been pretty close. He's called him a criminal. He's called him a killer. All the undiplomatic language that maybe President Erdogan has used, well, President Biden has used it towards Vladimir Putin. So Putin's probably not in actually much of a, he would probably favor not giving them, meaning the Harris campaign, a win, and would rather wait for any real major agreements on the Ukraine war, agree to China's claims, but wait till after the election to keep the Biden administration and in this case, the Harris VP campaign from getting a win. So it would be basically a thumb in the eye, much like what the Ayatollah Khomeini did in 1980 when he was Khomeini was in negotiation with the Carter administration to release the hostages, but the Iranians would not agree to release the hostages until after President Reagan became president. And sure enough, like 10 minutes after the President Reagan was sworn in, those hostages were on their way back to the U.S. just to put that thumb in the eye of President Carter to keep them having the economic win. So that almost seems like the motivation that you're seeing from Russia and President Putin. So he definitely does not have a desire to give the Biden administration a win on this one. and help their electoral chances. This is not anything about Putin favoring Trump, because again, he did not invade while Trump was president. If Trump was his buddy, President Trump was his buddy, he would have invaded Ukraine during the Trump administration, and he did not. He had invasions during of Crimea and the Donbass during Obama's administration, and then he had the major invasion that we're seeing now under the Biden administration. So I think any motivation by the Russians to wait till after the elections to make any major peace settlements is an attempt to get payback to the Biden administration. Also, time is on the Russian side because, again, to try to get these negotiations launched and moving in the 88, 87 days, whatever is left to the election, is a tall order. Probably the best you could hope for would be a ceasefire. And again, the clock is running against the strategy of the Chinese to have this war start winding down before the presidential election. Now, but I do think that they are strong indications that there is indications that a peace summit is going on. So again, bond settlement. Bondholders probably would not have agreed to a bond settlement if they believed that the war was going to go on and on and on. They would have probably just accepted default and go from there. Maybe seek some type of payment from the supporters, the Ukrainian supporters, but they didn't do that. So there's obviously some form of indication. You had the prisoner exchange, as I said earlier. You had the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative offered to the Ukrainians in exchange for recognition of the one China policy, in stark contrast to what the West believes about the rule of law and rule of international law. So then go on top of this is European Union president. European Union has a 6-month rotating presidency. This is different than the European Commission president of Ursula von der Leyen. This is a rotating president between member states. So the current president of the European Union is Viktor Orban, the prime minister of Hungary, who has been an advocate of finding a way out of the Ukraine war for quite some time. He tends to be viewed as being more favorable to the Russian position, and I think that is a fair statement to say. They have some issues with the Ukrainians. Not saying that he'll completely give in to the Russian point of view. He has spoke out against the war, but has not necessarily spoke out against the Russians, as he tries to keep favorable ties with both the Russians and the Ukrainians, much like Turkey does. But when Viktor Orban became the president of the EU, he met with President Zelensky in Belgium at the EU. There was some type of EU summit. President Zelensky, even though he's not a member of the European Union, was in attendance. They had a discussion. I believe it was like on a Tuesday that week that he became the European Union president. He flew to Kyiv later that week on the weekend. Then he went to Moscow to visit with President Putin. All this was to seek a way forward to ending the war. And he's flat out said that. Now, the European Commission and other European Union leaders lost their minds over this, that Viktor Orban's not speaking on behalf of the European Union. And he never said he was speaking on behalf of the European Union, but he was using, as I said, the bully pulpit of being the president of the EU to try to drive some of his foreign policy preferences, and that is ending the war in Ukraine. He also, from there, he flew to Beijing, the very same Beijing that President Zelensky's foreign minister, Dmytro Kuleba, was at. So Viktor Orban went there first, and then a couple weeks after, the foreign minister asked the Ukrainian foreign minister to come on over to Beijing and have a discussion. And we already talked about that. Saudi foreign minister went to Kyiv as well. And the Saudi foreign ministry has been playing a role with the Chinese to seek their peace proposal. So lo and behold, in that same period, the Saudi foreign minister goes to Kyiv to have discussions with President Zelensky. Turkey again has had conversations with Kyiv, Moscow, and Beijing as well. And then off on a weird tangent, former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson met with former President Trump at Mar-a-Lago to discuss peace in Ukraine as well. Now, Boris Johnson has been an advocate supporter of the Ukraine resistance to the Russian invasion. So him visiting President Trump to discuss the peace, what peace could look like in Ukraine, was a pretty significant breakthrough. And they came in that they believed, Boris Johnson, that they were in large agreement after their discussions. And again, the public position of the Trump administration is negotiating an end to the war. And they come out with, Boris Johnson comes out with some form of statement of agreement. Now, I'm not saying that President Trump is saying that the Ukrainians will surrender. I think he's I do believe it looks like he wants a fair settlement based on his statements about Ukraine when he was the president. So all these moving parts in a relatively short period of time, again, when you go in the context of the other steps, bond renegotiated, prisoner exchanges, there is a lot of moving parts that are going on that are moving towards the way of a peace settlement. The other issue that I've wrote about this too, is the Ukrainians had a poll through a Kyiv think tank to poll the population in the non-occupied areas about what they're willing to tolerate for peace. The population of Ukraine, are more open to peace than at any other point since the invasion. So there is obviously some form of war fatigue, understandably. The Ukrainian population has taken a brunt from we call a ruthless Russian offensive or war that often targets civilian areas, civilian infrastructure, and power structures. So they're just trying to make the lives miserable on top of this. Now, two things came out of this. Another thing came out of this is obviously, so they're open to concessions more so than they have at any other point since the start of the war. They are not, the Ukrainian population is not in a particular great move for territorial concessions to Russia. So that is a hard sticking point when your population, so it kind of limits what President Zelensky can negotiate, because if he gives too much territorial concessions, he knows that his people are not on that side of the, let's say on that side of the ledger when it comes to giving concessions to Russians. But also what stands out too, and probably more alarmingly, is I talked about earlier about the law between the Russians, the Ukrainians drafting younger people. The Ukrainian population, a fairly significant majority, said there's no shame by not agreeing to military service. So that's kind of like they're not in the mood to support the war. They are conceding. They're not. They're more open than ever time before to peace talks. But there's almost kind of this "not in my backyard" towards attitude that it's okay if somebody turns down military service. Well, somebody's got to fight this war. You're not going to make concessions, but you're okay with people not. That there's no shame and if they don't serve in this cause for national survival. It does show there is a lot of softness, more so on the concession side of it. So this think tank's polls is very instructive to the Ukrainians and shows that, the population is softening but there's not a lot of, when it comes to people's personal families or their situations, the idea of their loved ones going to war is, the view is, well, there's no shame in not volunteering. This shows a lot of softness in the Ukrainian position, or population's position about continuing the war. So it's instructive to the Ukrainians to seek a way forward of trying to put some priority to ending this war. Now, there's no guarantee that there's going to be peace in Ukraine, but there is a strong desire to end the war. You're seeing it on, the Russians have been the only ones that have not really signaled any strong desire to end the war, but that's kind of expected because they're kind of on the winning side right now. But it's costing them a lot. It's costing them a lot of men. And just as I saw about this, Ukrainians not hesitant to draft younger people because they're looking at the future of the country. The Russians, now they do have a 3.5, 4 to 1 manpower advantage of the Ukrainians. So again, they can give up more people, but they're also trading their future. They're trading their economic future, as so many Russians have left Russia to avoid military service. They've taken high casualties. They're trading a lot of their future, and even when you look at the growth, is in even despite the Western sanctions, you look at the growth in the Russian economy. Is, yes, they're growing, but a lot of that's through war spending, and they've actually kind of squeezed as much as they can out of that. And so when you start looking at comp rates and stuff like that, you're going to probably see the GDP start dropping. You probably won't see a 5.4 because they've taken a lot of the slack out of the economy through war spending. At some point, that's going to catch up with them because war spending doesn't necessarily grow your economy because you're just spending money on things that ultimately get destroyed. So it doesn't actually contribute to making any type of future investment. Like if you created a brand new type of computer that something like that could pay dividends to the future. That doesn't happen necessarily with the machineries of war. So the Russians are really trading a lot of their future. They're trading their future economic prospects. They're trading a lot of their future prospects. So even though they've not signaled wanting to end the war, there is a lot of pressure on them to end the war as well, though they're not stating it. So just going to be the questions is kind of what I talked about before. What does Ukraine's biggest concern is security. They want to know how are they going to guarantee security if they're not allowed to join NATO or EU. What do they get out of this? That's going to be the basic question. And the Russians are going to be kind of in the same boat. What needs to be done to keep the West off their borders? The problem with that now is that was a legitimate concern prior to the invasion, is the idea of not having NATO right on their border if Ukraine joined NATO. Because of the Russians' decision to go to war, now they have Finland and Ukraine there on the border. So now NATO is on their border as a result of the war, and that doesn't include what's happening with Ukraine. So it would be, I think there's probably some more pressure on the Russians to come to peace negotiations, especially if the Chinese start bringing up the issue. And the Chinese they've got their own issues in Asia. They've got their own issues with their economy. They got their own issues with their demographic positions. And they have a relatively, not a short time, but they have a relatively limited time to achieve the goals that they want to achieve in the Pacific and not have this European sideshow going on. So especially a sideshow they can't control necessarily. So we'll see what more to come, but the fact that the bond payment came up and they were able to negotiate it when it would be overall there would be no real motivation by bondholders to forgive debt and delay payments if they thought that the war was going to continue. So lots of indications, read one article that said the old situation is like when you see there's smoke, there's somewhere there's fire, and there's a lot of smoke going on right now. Doesn't guarantee anything, but it definitely looks like things are moving into a serious direction of peace. And again, that's what the deputy of Ukraine's military intelligence said. He thought that 2025 would be the year of the negotiated settlement, and it seems to be moving in that direction. So obviously more to come. It's been one of my topics du jour to talk about Ukraine peace talks. All right, so I went off on a little tangent on the next paper. It's one of my favorite nerd topics is the space. I've always been interested in space as far as I can remember. When I was a little kid, I remember the later Apollo missions, the J missions, I guess is what they call it. Of course, I didn't know they were the J missions when I was a kid. So I remember landing on the moon, the returning of the capsules, and I've talked about the watching the CBS News with Walter Cronkite, and he'd be down at the Cape, and there's the Atlas V rocket in the background, and always had an interest in the space program. Always the camera, thought there was like some really high speed when the digital camera would be flipping, showing the countdown 10, 9, 8. Yeah, but get me very nerdy about the idea. But I've always been interested in the space program as pretty much as long as I can remember. So this has always been one of my interesting conversations. So Starliner is obviously, we'll just say Boeing has had a challenging year. As before we get into Starliner, Starliner has been an issue going on and on since they became one of the two companies in the NASA's commercial flight program. The idea is NASA wanted to get out of the mundane business of flights into low Earth orbit, especially after the retirement of shuttle. NASA didn't want to get in the business of creating a new rocket system, a new launch system to be created on their own to continue on with the ISS or any other International Space Station, ISS, or any other future space station. They wanted to move to a commercial program where NASA would contract with these commercial programs to ferry astronauts and cargo to first it was cargo to the International Space Station, and then it was later became astronauts. So one of the initial contract signers of this was Boeing. Obviously, Boeing has a lot of experience in the military defense sector, the aeronautics sector, and weapons sector. So the government had a pretty significant relationship with Boeing, and a generally positive one. So Boeing became one of the primary carriers, and probably was considered what was considered the lead carrier of the new commercial program that was signed in 2010. The other one was SpaceX, relatively new comer to the space area of the commercial space market. And again, obviously NASA was impressed where the direction that SpaceX was going, but they did not think that they would become the lead program. So we'll go through the history of delays and all that, and there was a lot of them going through the program. Just again, signed in 2010. They thought that they would be able to launch as early as 4 years. Well, that obviously didn't work. And then the Starliner had a number of other issues that went on with it. They had a lot of technical issues with creating the Starliner. They had software issues. They had issues with thruster integration. They had issues with their escape system. They had issue with their parachute not opening on one of them because there's a 3 parachute system to help land the Starliner. During a unmanned test flight, one of the parachutes failed. Had a lot of issues. Now, SpaceX didn't necessarily have an easy time either. they one of their successful unmanned program tests went up to the International Space Station with no issue. When they were testing, once that capsule returned, they tested the escape thrusters as a separate test, and they blew the capsule up. That delayed the program. Also, SpaceX had issues with deploying of parachutes. So again, this was new technology, and things were not going smoothly for either company, but things were definitely going a lot smoother for SpaceX than it was going for Boeing. So finally, after even like long-term delays, but even short-term delays, where Starliner was going to launch in May, they found some more. They found leaks. They found corrosion in some of the thrusters. They were forced. They had the Starliner on the pad. They had to roll it back. They had roughly a month to fix it. They brought it back out to the pad. Looked like, hey, we're getting ready to go. And then leaks appeared again. Helium leaks appeared again. But they were able to fix them. And finally, on June 5th, 2024, a United Launch Alliance, which is a rocket alliance between Boeing and Lockheed Martin. I guess it's just Lockheed, not Lockheed Martin anymore. And they were able to take an Atlas V rocket, one of the last remaining Atlas V rockets, and launch the Starliner space capsule into orbit. So this was, again, supposed to be a short test mission to the ISS, 8 to 10 days long. This was finally all this stuff, because you've obviously in the news, unrelated subject, with issues with Boeing aircraft, the 737 particularly having issues, just cascading failures after failures after failures. They had the 2 whistleblowers die of suicide. Not going to read into that, but kind of get it. It's been a terrible time for Boeing. So it finally looked like this cloud, finally success, this long-awaited program was finally they launched the Starliner with veteran astronaut Barry Butch Wilmore, and Sunita Williams were able to launch into orbit. And during the rendezvous phase, so there's rendezvous and docking. Rendezvous is when you basically chase down in this case, the ISS, and then you have to have rendezvous to attain docking. So they were able to get this in there. So talk a little bit about Butch Wilmore is the commander of the what's called the crew flight test, CFT flight. And he was in his 4th space flight. Sunita Williams was in her 3rd, but she was the former female record holder for the most hours of a spacewalk. I think she had 5 spacewalks and something incredible, like 40, maybe even 50 hours of spacewalk time. I think she also flew on both Space Shuttle and on a Soyuz rocket. So she's been in several spaces. So this is like her 3rd space vehicle. And I think, I don't think Wilmore flew on Soyuz. I think he's just been on the shuttle and now this one. So they were launched into space, again, on an 8-day mission. So during the rendezvous phase, they were roughly about 200 meters, 220 yards or so from the International Space Station on approaching the docking, when they lost some of their thrusters, and the helium leak had come back. So it had delayed the docking procedures, but they were able to successfully dock with the ISS. Now, the issue with this docking, so this was the first manned flight. They've done 2 unmanned flights. One was a success that had issues even when it returned, but it was generally a success. They had an unsuccessful unmanned flight test as well. So this was the first time. So finally they reached the International Space Station with a capsule that had the ongoing issues with thrusters, which again, these were ongoing issues for years. They had the helium leak, which was a stubborn issue that was going on as well. but they were finally able to get to the International Space Station with a crew. 4 years behind SpaceX. So SpaceX was able to do this mission to the International Space Station actually more than 4 years faster than Boeing. Now, Boeing was considered actually to be again, they were expected to be the first ones to reach the International Space Station. So obviously they had issues in there, and when they gave the confidence that NASA had in Boeing, is they actually gave them a bigger chunk of money than they did to SpaceX. I think the initial round of money was like $4 billion to Boeing and like just under $2 billion for SpaceX. And the idea that they argue later is that the Boeing capsule was supposed to be more capable than the SpaceX Crew Dragon. Two things that the idea was that the Crew Dragon was it was going to ferry astronauts and cargo to the International Space Station, and it could dock for up to, I think, 210 days on the space station, and then it could operate something like, I think, a week or so without being connected to any type of, basically operate on its own power along with the any type of solar panels. It was not meant to be a lifeboat. The Starliner was meant to be a lifeboat. It was meant to be, right now the current lifeboats are Soyuz capsules. So the Starliner was envisioned to become a long-term American version of the lifeboats. So these are things that if something goes wrong with the International Space Station, the crews go to these lifeboat of spacecraft, and they can be used to jettison and go back to Earth. So Starliner was supposed to be one of these options along with the Soyuz. And also, if you have other crews up there, obviously if Dragon's up there, which actually coincidentally, Crew Dragon and Starliner and Soyuz are all up there right now. But anyway, the Starliner was supposed to be a lifeboat option that Crew Dragon never was supposed to be. But more importantly, Starliner was to be able to provide a boost capability to the space station, because every so often the space station has to be boosted into a higher orbit, because even though it's in orbit, it's in low Earth orbit, so it has what's called atmospheric drag on it. So it will slowly get slower and slower and slower. As it gets slower, it starts dropping its orbit. What happens is you need to have some type of boost capability to put it back into a higher orbit. That was originally done by the space shuttle. And obviously, the space shuttle's been retired. The Soyuz capsules have taken over that role. And in this case, the Starliner was supposed to be able to give that boost ability to for the space station, while it's given an American version, not be reliant on the Russian Soyuz, especially when the Russians are talking about. Now, I don't think they'll do this, but they threatened to leave the ISS program. And if they left, there would be no ability to boost the orbit of ISS. And Starliner right now is not really in a position to do that, because the 8 to 10 day mission, because the significance of the fuel leak and the thrusters shutting down issue, the astronauts' 8 to 10 day mission has been extended to 62 days. And as of yesterday, meaning NASA, said it could be as late as February 2025 before they return. Now, there's some issues with that. About the question is if Starliner is really rated to be up there, because the original rating material, now I know they can play with the numbers, they can do things to help Starliner's extension. It was only rated to be up there for 70 days. So they're at 60, I think they're about 65 days. So Starliner, or Boeing and NASA, had to make a decision what to do. Did they need to bring the astronauts back home? So we'll talk a little bit about what was going on with Starliner. So again, I can get really nerdy in this, is again, the issues with the helium leak, which is used to charge the propulsion system. Basically, it keeps you don't want, especially in if I remember right, in 0G, you don't want to have fuel lines empty. So you don't want. It's hard to push fuel when you have no gravity loops. So you use pressurized fuel lines. Helium is used to pressurize these lines. Now, it is leaking, so if you're leaking helium, you're not going to be able to pressurize your fuel line. Boeing and NASA have confirmed that they have 10 times as much helium than what they need. So that's not, helium is less of a concern than it is the problems with the thrusters shutting down, which happened during the between rendezvous and docking, where they had the thruster shut down. So the issue with it is that that they decided to delay the return of Starliner because of this. Now, this is not good, but the idea is, and NASA and Boeing were not the best at communicating because they allowed a story to escape that these astronauts were stranded on the space station. Yes, they were not being able to return on the scheduled time, but the idea is that the Starliner is divided into two major parts. Three, if you can consider the solar panels. You got the service module, or I'm sorry, the capsule where the crew is, the crew capsule. And then you have your ablative shield for heated reentry, and then you have the service module. Now, the service module is only used to get when you get in orbit, rendezvous, docking, help maintain the long-term service of the spacecraft. When the return, the service module is cut away, much like what you saw, if you remember, in the Apollo program. They didn't bring the service module back, they just brought the capsule back. Well, Starliner operates in such a way. The thrusters that went out are actually on the service module. So if NASA and Boeing decide to bring the astronauts home immediately and not risk something eroding in the service module and the thruster system becoming worse, is they would lose the service module because it would burn up in the atmosphere, and any ability to test the issues with the thrusters would be lost. But what they've been able to do by delaying the astronauts' return is they've been able to gather data on the thrusters, and they've been able to recreate at White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico the current status of the thrusters on Starliner, and then be able to test and test and test. And this was coming out last week with roughly a week or so. So the clock was ticking, and they talk more and more about it because a lot of people in the press remember, hey, 70 days, you're only rated for 70 days. So NASA and Boeing said, yes, if we had to return Starliner now, we feel confident that if an emergency situation come up, we could use Starliner, return to Earth, and there would not be an issue. But they say that, but then they weren't really willing to return the astronauts immediately. So they go in there, and NASA and Boeing quite understandably want to test because, again, this is a new spacecraft, still in the experimental phase. It's not operational yet. So this is still an experimental spacecraft, unlike Crew Dragon, which has already passed the experimental phase and is an actual operational spacecraft. Starliner's not there yet. So they want to find out, well, what is the issue, especially on a program that has had so many issues in the past, especially with the thrusters. So they wanted to test. So they were able to recreate the issues. And so they revealed that there was a heat buildup on the thrusters that caused the Teflon seals on the bus. The thrusters, I had to write these notes down, to the seals to bulge, which restricted the volume of propellant flowing into the thruster, and the computer shut down the thrusters because of that. So they feel like they could, the official is that they feel like that they could fix the thruster issue, or they may not need all the thrusters, or they can find a way to override the issue that the computer is saying, which I guess that would mean most likely that the thrusters would be less efficient. But you're kind of playing with an issue when you don't fully charge a a system, a thrust system, is bad things can happen, like blowing up. So it seems like that kind of weird. It's like you would lose that you could just run them at a lower rate. Maybe they're set up to be this way. Usually your type of thrusters that are used in these orbits are not meant to be these variable thrust, but I guess they could be, because that did happen on the Apollo system. So it just seems kind of questionable, but they said they feel like they could come back to Earth. But they still did not. So they come out, they release their findings and say, yes, we feel like we can control this and we can return to Earth. But they still didn't set a date of return for Starliner. And again, they have the original 70-day clock is close to an end this week. So they had to make a decision this week. Again, there's some ways they can work around it. It is with the, if it was going to be a lifeboat, Starliner was supposed to be a lifeboat for the ISS. It was obviously supposed to be rated longer than 70 days. But that was the original expectation, that the Starliner could only operate in this mission for 70 days before it needed to return. So this kind of puts a quandary for NASA. So the Starliner doesn't have an auto dock release system. So even though it can operate automatically or has an automated system, it doesn't have an automated, the current software does not have an automated dock release. That means somebody has to be inside the capsule to release it. So that means it has to be crewed. So for success for Boeing and the Starliner program is they need to have a successful return of Wilmore and Williams inside Starliner. So the worst case scenario that in this, knowing that success is the only way they can assure that the Starliner program will continue is return of Williams and Wilmore inside the current Starliner. The worst case scenario is that Starliner cannot successfully return from orbit and its crew on board. And obviously that would be a tragedy for NASA. They'd lose 2 veteran astronauts in a public relations debacle on with all types of accusations that you risked 2 astronauts on a system that was clearly broken. Again, there's a lot of, there's risk in spaceflight, but the public would view this as an unrealistic list or unrealistic risk to take. The other option is, okay, we leave Starliner up there, Williams and Wilmore return on a SpaceX capsule. And so apparently there's discussions with SpaceX to do a rescue mission. And actually SpaceX has delayed the launch of Crew 9 of roughly a month to late September. Crew 8 is currently up there on the ISS with a Crew Dragon, and they're set to return this month. So there might be an option to launch a rescue mission from Starliner, or sorry, not from Starliner, from SpaceX and Crew Dragon to bring Wilmore and Williams back home. But that would also be an end to the Starliner program. So the only successful way that Starliner can continue is a successful return of Wilmore and Williams, but the price is too high if they're not able to get them back. Like if they die for some reason, because Starliner cannot do its mission. Again, so there's no real good option for Starliner and Boeing. So they're delaying this decision, and apparently they have delayed the decision up to February 2025. So they've delayed the decision, and they can leave Wilmore and Williams up there. Now, it's not a problem with food or supplies. It's maybe a little crowded right now with Crew 8 and the Russians up there, and then having Williams and Wilmore up there. But they can do it. They can just send up resupply programs. There's not talking about returning on a Russian Soyuz, but that would also be an option. But I think as long as there is a SpaceX option, I think they would NASA would choose SpaceX rescue mission if they feel like the risk of returning Starliner is too high. It tells me that unless, for example, there's a software that they can do, update that they can do, and they just need to write it. It's going to take some time, and they can upload it to Starliner. Or if a resupply mission comes up there with some hardware for Starliner, it just does not seem like the fact that they've extended the stay of Wilmore and Williams out to possibly February 2025 tells me that they're not going to return the Starliner with the crew in it. I just feel like at this point, if they can't do it now, what makes them think that they can do it in 6 months from now? It seems like at this point, this is not part of the paper. This just came out just shortly thereafter. So this is not a good, despite the fact and the quite logical fact of not returning quickly, because they could do detailed tests on what caused Starliner to have the issues, so that if they take these tests, they recreate them, they could actually fix it in the future and they have a successful Starliner program. The fact that they're not returning them in 6 months, even though they know what the issue is, tells me that this could very well be the end of the Starliner program. I just don't see them. Again, things can change. Maybe they can reevaluate, and they'll just say, "Hey, we updated the software. We've brought up some spare parts from, let's say, Crew 9 brings up some Boeing parts on a SpaceX capsule." Maybe that can happen. I haven't read all the details, but if they're not going to bring them home now, why would we think that it's going to be any better in 6 months from now? They already understand the issue, unless there's something that they're not talking about. Now, the reason why I want Starliner success, and it's really kind of disheartening to see this, and not because I'm actually a big SpaceX fan. Starliner is a more advanced system than Crew Dragon, but if it's so advanced that it doesn't work, I'd rather take the Crew Dragon. What SpaceX has done has been absolutely fantastic, but the fact is, the U.S. really needs a backup system. When Challenger blew up on the pad, when Columbia broke up on reentry, and then when they retired the shuttle fleet, the U.S. did not have an ability to get into space. They relied on the Russians, or we just didn't go to space. So if you have the Starliner, if Starliner and Crew Dragon, you have a program that works where if one system has a problem, the other one can pick up the slack, and vice versa. The likelihood of both programs being so well tested and both of them having going out of commission at the same time is pretty remote. But they did ground Falcon 9, which is the only other human-rated, which is SpaceX, and it's the only other human-rated rocket. It had a failure, a very unusual failure in orbit, where it was not able to place the, I think it was a fuel leak, and it wasn't able to get the payload up to the desired orbit. So Falcon 9 was actually grounded for a couple weeks, and it was only able to get back on so quickly because the fantastic record that Falcon 9 has. I mean, they're launching like twice a week. It's got an incredible success record. So they were able to turn that around. But again, that just shows that just at one point, for a few fleeting weeks, the U.S. lost, not fleeting weeks, but for 2 weeks, the U.S. did not have any way approved rocket to get up to the space station, even though they had a Starliner and a Crew Dragon up at the space station. So this is the importance of having a backup. And my concern is, by delaying this return for so long, a Starliner, it almost makes it feel like it's lost. It would be a major campaign or major issue for Starliner to be considered its program to go on if they fail to return Wilmore and Williams on a capsule or on the Starliner itself. So it's not a good thing that it looks like Crew Dragon will be the only game in town for any time in the near future, with the only hope that looking out there is Sierra Space with the Dream Chaser, which is call it a miniature version of the shuttle, is on, they're trying to create a human-rated spaceship. So The hope is that either we get Starliner return successfully and get the program back on track, which seems like a long shot now that they've decided to delay the return of Starliner basically indefinitely. Of course, they might say, hey, we're going to bring it back in 2 weeks, and that would be fun. But if they wait 6 months until February 2025, I don't see them bringing Williams and Wilmore on that back on Starliner, and that would end the program. So the only hope is hopefully Dream Chaser will be available from Sierra Space in next few years, so that Crew Dragon is not the only human-rated spaceship. So, of course, we don't want to get it back in, and with all the issues with the Ukraine, I don't think anybody wants to get back onto the Soyuz program, paying $55 million or $35 million a seat when it's much, much cheaper to operate on the SpaceX Falcon and Crew Dragon combination. So get a little nerdy on that. I think I've listened to a lot of, excuse me, a lot of space channels on YouTube. Yeah, I rarely get into the whole space program. Brings me back to my childhood. So I'm hoping successful return of the Starliner, but looking more and more doubtful. So, excuse me, I'm putting my hope in continued success of Crew Dragon and a quick bringing on a Sierra Space's Dream Chaser to give us some type of safety in space if we have multiple programs operating. All right, so this is going to be a really short one. It's going to be the West Philippines Newsletter, Volume 10, and it's the Philippine Congress debating the Maritime Zone Act. This was proposed, it's been going through different iterations. It's been in and out through committees in the Philippine Congress, mainly their Senate, where it passed unanimously in February. And then, of course, I guess what we would call in the U.S. is markups occurring on the version of the bill. Well, it finally passed by the Philippine Congress and is currently awaiting President Ferdinand Marcos Jr.'s signature. He's the president of the Philippines. To make that into law. No real indications whether it's going to be signed, but most likely, based on the what the law is trying to attempt, is most likely the law will be signed. So the bill does not specifically mention China, but the law is clearly, or it's a bill, not a law yet. It's a bill. They operate very similar to the U.S. system, so. Obviously, the U.S. influence on the Philippines. The act is based on the 2016 ruling by the Hague Arbitration Court against China and its claims in the South China Sea, which includes the West Philippine Sea. The act is what comes into is that. Obviously, the Chinese did not recognize the ruling by the Hague, and the Hague lacks jurisdiction if one party or the other doesn't sign on to the arbitration, and in this case, China didn't. It was just the Philippines. Is the Hague cannot do any type of binding, or at least in this case, they cannot do a binding. Law where it forces China to abide by the law, or abide by the findings. So since China did not participate in the arbitration, they were not bound by the findings of the arbitration, which the arbitration court did rule against the Chinese and their weak historic claims in the South China Sea and the West Philippine Sea. So this act, what it does, it will codify the findings of the Hague's findings so that at least it's written in some form of law in the Philippines, because currently it's just a finding that they point back to, which certainly aligns with the United Nations law of the sea. So this is not like some weird arbitration ruling that is so far beyond the pale. It aligns quite clearly with the UN's law of the sea, which China is a signatory of. So this is not some outrageous ruling from The Hague, but because China didn't participate, it was not a legally binding agreement. So the Philippines go back and they point to the act and say, okay, the arbitration court said this was what the Chinese saying is illegal, but it has no power of law. Doesn't have the binding ability of law. So what happens is the Philippines are going to pass this act, and basically they're going to codify the ruling of The Hague of 2016 into Philippine law. Now, go into this, if the Chinese do not follow the laws of the sea as determined by the arbitration court, what makes you think that they're going to follow this Philippine law? They're not. They're not going to do it. So a couple things that the law does add is it does give the right to enforce that Philippines the right to enforce their exclusive economic zone in accordance with the arbitration ruling and in accordance to international maritime law, and allows a $1 million fine for each violation. Now, the fact is, all right, they're not going to follow this. They're not going to get fined. The Philippines are not going to enforce it. The Chinese are not going to be hauled before some court in Manila to follow this. So it feels escalatory. Just seems like purposely the Philippines are doing something to escalate the situation in the South China Sea, in the West Philippine Sea. And you could see at face value that is true, because all they're doing is threatening China with a new law, a law that they're not going to follow, the law that the Philippines know the Chinese are not going to follow. So what is the point? Now, it does issue a fine. It does allow dismantling, confiscation of Chinese artificial islands, such as the Hughes Reef, which is a part of it drove many of the claims of the original 2016 arbitration of this militarized artificial island. Now, the Philippine Coast Guard, again, the Coast Guard sits in this weird gray area, but it's kind of law enforcement, it's kind of military, is because the ruling of The Hague is not binding, because China did not participate and did not recognize the ruling, is the Philippine Coast Guard doesn't really have jurisdiction or enforcement ability on a law that doesn't exist. I mean, everybody knows it exists. They know they're violating the term, but because the rules of the arbitration stated that it's not binding, they ruled against China, but it's not binding. There's nothing to bind as far as law goes for the Philippine Coast Guard to enforce against the Chinese. So this law will give some ability of the Philippine Coast Guard to act within the color of law. Again, color of law that the Chinese are not going to follow, but it also means that there's a possibility that in some areas, the Philippine Coast Guard will have the ability to act against any type of Chinese ship that's violating Philippines' access to their EEZ, exclusive economic zone, which you're seeing around the Escoda Shoal. The Philippine Coast Guard is maintaining a permanent presence with the idea of trying to prevent any type of formation of new islands, because the Chinese were caught after the fact of trying to build an artificial reef in the Escoda Shoal. So ever since then, the Philippines have maintained a permanent presence to try to discourage the Chinese from continuing their operations. If the Chinese chose to do the operations to continue, yes, okay, the Coast Guard could intervene, but they have no real law authority to do so. And again, when you're talking about the system that NATO talks about, when I talked about earlier, is when you talk about international rules-based order that the Philippines are standing on the grounds of, because that's what Japanese view, that's what the U.S. says, they talk about the international rules-based order. What they're saying is what the Chinese doing is not part of the international rules-based order. Well, if you have international rules-based order and you have no standing to enforce a 2016 ruling, because again, it was non-binding, and you have no law written, it's a little hard for the Philippines to act in an international rules-based order. By passing this, it does add some color of law. It will allow the Coast Guard to act if they choose to do so. And it also allows them to call in international partners to assist and still have the color of law. Now, I'm not a lawyer, so I may be missing something on this. I'm certainly not a maritime expert, but it seems like that's the purpose of it. But I say that I think the real purpose is when President Marcos brought about the situation with the issues of highlighting the illegal activities and the outrageous activities of the Chinese in the West Philippine Sea and the South China Sea, the idea was to internalize it within the Philippine people. That, hey, this is real actions the Chinese are doing that are impacting the lives of ordinary Filipinos that are trying to make a living by operating within the legally recognized exclusive economic zone of the West Philippine Sea, and the Chinese were denying Philippine citizens that. So the idea was to internalize it, that the Chinese are taking something from you. And so what happens is this Maritime Act will actually serve as internalizing into Philippine law, so that the Philippine sovereignty and its claims in the West Philippine Sea are now codified in their law. So even when President Marcos' term ends and he goes about into retirement, and most likely it looks like Sara Duarte it will be probably the next president after him, this will be part of Philippine law and not something that can simply be ignored in negotiations with the Chinese. Whether, let's say, I'm not saying she is, but let's say she's more favorable to the Chinese than what President Marcos is, there will be a Philippine law that cannot be ignored by future administrations. So it's part of the idea of codifying and internalizing the rulings of the 2016 court, and again highlighting it to the Philippine people that, hey, this is part of what China is doing to you by making these claims, and then making it again part of law. It's just, again, it's part of a process of internalizing to the Philippine population of what is happening in the South China Sea and how it's really affecting their lives. So, a very short article this week, probably I think the shortest West Philippine Sea newsletter I did. It focused on one issue. I thought it was interesting that I didn't know that about the arbitrations not having any type of binding effect if one party chooses not to attend the arbitration. So that is it for the week. I know I said this week I was going to start going to a paid only service and just provide samples and shorter parts of my articles to free subscribers. I did some work, read actually a number of articles about increasing Substack subscribers and followers, and in the last week I have doubled the number of subscribers and nearly tripled the number of followers. So that's I want to hold off at least a week to see if I can continue that growth. I don't want to put a paid service and then all of a sudden put a end to the growth there. And it could also help me determine what a future strategy of what paid subscribers get versus free subscribers, and maybe create a little bit more clear delineation of what the two services between paid and unpaid get. So I'm going to hold off at least another week. To continue the growth. I want to say all the new followers, thank you for joining. I really very much appreciate your support, your decision to become subscribers and followers. It's very much appreciated. To all my original followers and supporters and subscribers, thank you for continuing on this. Again, you can reach me through, I'll have various links that you can see my work, but there's nothing that is put on any other service that is not on Substack. That's why you see so many different versions of same things on my Substack, because I've made a determination there would not be any type of content on any other service, whether it's YouTube, Rumble, X, that will not be on Substack. So that's why you'll see these shorts where I don't really need them for Substack, but I put them on YouTube. I just want to make sure that, hey, there's nothing on these other channels that you don't get on Substack. So that's why I do that. So again, hope for future growth. If you're new or a existing follower, spread the word. I hate to say it's that it's a numbers game, but it's a numbers game to be able to start getting some legitimacy in what I'm doing. Also helps me get better and better and getting an idea of what how I can make my writing better, how I can become more clear, both in my presentation on this podcast and also in my writing. So appreciate the feedback. I find that the feedback that I get on Substacks is much more courteous, much more professional, much more constructive than some of the things that you hear on or read on some of the other services. Not saying they're all bad, but sometimes it can get spicy out there at times. So thank you for joining. I hope all of you have a great rest of your weekend or a great rest of your week. I will be back next week, and thank you again for listening. Have a good day. Bye.